Hey Sammies, I'm Christina, and today we will go over what a variable is and how we use them in SAMMI. First things first, what is a variable? Let's ask our new friend, ChatGPT, what is a variable in programming? And it says that a variable is a named storage location in the computer's memory that holds a value, and it can be changed, varied during the program's execution. I actually have an illustration of what a variable is. You can see the memory here, the variables A, B, C, D, and the values that are assigned to them. It's similar to having a drawer or drawers in real life, where each one of the drawers stores a piece of information for us. So on this picture, you can see Sami trying to open one of the drawers. And it would probably take him quite a bit of time to figure out what's inside of each drawer because they are not labeled. So this is why we have variable names. A variable name is a unique name you assign to the variable, which is kind of like putting a label on the drawer so we know what exactly it stores. We can also have different types of variables, which is similar to having different shaped and sized drawers for different pieces of information. For example, a variable can store our viewer's name, which would be a string variable or text variable. And another variable could store the amount of viewers we have, which would be a number variable. So now that we kind of understand what a variable is, let's take a look at how variables work in SAMMI. In SAMMI, we have local, button, and global variables. Local variables are assigned to each SAMMI button and can be directly accessed from within its own button. You can think of a SAMMI button as a chest of drawers, storing an infinite amount of drawers. How do we create a new variable? We can use either set a local variable command or set string variable command. Both commands do the same. They create a new local variable inside our button. There are some differences we will explain later. But for now, let's just try to create a new variable called count, which is 10. And if we run the button and open our variable window, we will see that count is 10. And this is a button ID 328 local variable. And you can access a local variable in your other commands by simply typing its name if it's inside the same button. So for example, let's say our local variable count is 10 now, and we want to display an alert saying what the count is. So we will add a new command called alert, and message will be count is count. If we run the button, we see count is 10 alert. If you notice, the variable is wrapped, and we will go over that later as well, because in some boxes you can directly insert it, and in some of them you need to wrap it. So next we have button variables, and these are essentially local variables stored in other buttons, which we access a bit differently than local variables, because we need to specify which button ID is storing them. So for example, in this image, button 1 variables, local variables are viewer name and viewer count. Button 2 local variables are viewer color and viewer subage. And button 3 has one local variable called viewer is sub. Now, if we want to access button 1 or button 2's local variables in our button 3, we will need to use something called getButtonVariable command. In this example, we have button 1, which has two local variables, viewer name and viewer count. If we open variable window, we can see them right here. Button 2's variables are viewer color and viewer subage. Again, you can see the variables here. And button 3 variables are, well, there's just one. It's called viewer is sub, which is 1 or 2. So what if we need the variable from our button 1 inside the button 3? So in our button 1, we want the viewer name variable inside our button 3. Well, we can use getButtonVariable command, which will look into our button 1 and grab the variable from it. So it was a variable called viewer name. Button ID is the button 1 ID, which is button 1. And we will save it as button 3's local variable. In that case, we can give it the same name, but we don't have to. We can save it as, let's say, just name, and it'll work. So if we run the button now, SAMMI will know to look into button 1, which is this button, and it will know that it should look for a variable called viewer name, and it will save it as our button 3's local variable called name. So let's see if that works. And here you go, name is SAMMI. So this is how you can work with local variables from other buttons. Now, you're gonna wonder, well, if I can get the button variable, can I also set the button variable? Let's say we want to set button 1's viewer name variable to a different name. Well, we can do that with setButtonVariable command. Button ID will be our button 1. Variable name will be viewer name. And let's say we want to set it to, well, it's not gonna be SAMMI anymore. It can be, for example, Sebas. If we run this button, and now we go and look into our button 1, open variable window, we will see that viewer name in our button 1 has been set to Sebas. So this is how you can set local variables in other buttons. Lastly, we have global variables. And these variables can be accessed from any button at all times. It's kind of like having one big chest of drawers that's in our lobby or living room, where every person living in that house can access. Now, as you can imagine, it would be total chaos if we stored everything in there, as it would take forever for anyone to find any relevant information. And some people would probably go and use the same labels for the drawers and essentially overwrite them. And for this reason, you should only use global variables to read them. And you should use either local or button variables to store your own information. So let's see what they are. In SAMMI, we have a lot of pre-made global variables that can help you with your commands in your buttons. For example, there is a pre-made variable called mouse X and mouse Y, which gives you your current mouse position. There is also one that's called since 2020, which is a timestamp, and so on. So how can you get a global variable inside your button? Well, you can use getGlobalVariable command. And let's say we want to get our mouse X global variable. So it will be mouse X. And we can save it as local variable called, like, let's say mouse X. If we run the button, our mouse X will be 1073. Now, there is one interesting thing, is when we run this command, what actually happens is that the current value of the global variable mouse X is copied into our local variable mouse x. So it will not be updating the x position of our mouse in real time. We would need to run a get global variable command again. So if we compare it, our mouse x is now 1073. If we compare it to our global variable called mouse x, as you can see, this one is changing because SAMMI is updating the global variable. However, our local variable is just the value that was copied from the global variable when we ran the button, so it will not be updated. Now, there are a few rules that we need to follow when we are using set variable commands. First rule is that if we set the variable, for example, variable name to SAMMI in one command, and then we use another command, set local variable, with the same variable name, and we set it to, let's say, Sebas instead. What is going to happen that SAMMI will first set name to SAMMI, and then it will override name with Sebas. So if we run the button, name will actually be Sebas. Another rule is that variable names are case sensitive. That means that if we have count, which is 10, and then we set another local variable, capitalized count is 15, and run the button, we will notice we have two separate variables, count, which is 10, and capitalized count, which is 15. Variable names need to start with a letter and can only contain letters, numbers, and underscores. So if, for example, viewer count, this is okay. Viewer 5 count, this is okay too. But this is not okay because it starts with a number and not a letter. You also should not do this, underscore letter. It always has to start with a letter. When you are creating a new variable, you don't need to declare it first or specify its type. SAMMI will automatically figure it out for you. So for example, if we tell SAMMI, hey, here's a new drawer that I labeled bananas, and this is what I store in it. If it's actually bananas that I'm storing in it, SAMMI will automatically figure it out and mark it as fruit. So in our example, if we assign 10 value to our count variable, and then we use get variable type command, and we will name it type of count. We want to check what count is, and we run the button. SAMMI will tell us the type of count is number, so it immediately knows that we are storing a number in our count variable. We do not need to specify that. Let's go back to our set local variable command and set string variable command. As I mentioned earlier, both commands do the same. They will create or modify an existing local variable. As you can notice, this variable box is yellow in set local variable command, and this box is white in set string variable command. And this is probably the most important part that you need to understand when working in SAMMI, is the difference between yellow and white boxes. So what is the difference? Yellow boxes assume that they will contain either numbers or other variables. So for example, if I set local variable count to 50, and then another local variable count 2, which is going to be, let's say, count plus 10. So it will be 60 because we are grabbing this count variable and we are adding 10. We can directly insert count into the yellow box and 10 as well. And for any math operations, we just need to enclose it in brackets. So now if we run this button, count is 50 and count 2 is 60. White boxes assume that anything inside of them is a string or text. So, for example, message can be hello world, how are you today? And if we run a button, message will be hello world, how are you today? Now, what happens if we actually want to use set local variable command to set our plain text? So let's say message will be hello world, how are you today? But the box is not white, but it's yellow. In this case, as yellow box assumes that it's either a number or variable, we have to wrap any text or string in quotes. It can be either double quotes like this, or it can be single quotes like this. Let's say this is gonna be called message white box, and this will be message yellow box. And we run these two commands. We will see that message white box and message yellow box are identical. This means that SAMMI will save the value in the same way in these two boxes. So in white boxes, you do not wrap your string or text in any quotes, and you can also use new lines. So new line, another new line, run the button. And here we go. We have text with new lines. For yellow boxes, you need to use either single or double quotes. Now, let's say we have a local variable called count, which is a 10. And we want another local variable called, let's say, count2, which is supposed to contain anything that's inside our count variable. If we run the button, we will notice we have count, which is 10, and count2 is also 10. What happens if we actually want to set a string variable? So let's say count2 yellow box, and this will be count2 white box. And we want to set this box to the same value as our count2 yellow box. Well, so what happens if we just copy the value here? If we run the button, we will notice that count is 10, which is the first variable from here. Count2 yellow box is 10 as well, but count2 white box is count. It's not 10. Why? Well, it's because SAMMI thinks that whatever inside a white box is plain text. So how do we tell SAMMI, hey, this is a variable and we want you to actually grab the variable's value? Well, we can wrap it in /$ $/. So if we run the button now, count2 white box will be 10. Notice that it's still a string. It's not a number because we are setting a string variable after all. Another example is, let's say our local variable viewer count is 50. And we want to send an alert message showing what the count is. So we would say viewer count is currently, and now we would copy the variable name. Well, this is not going to work because SAMMI will not know that viewer count is actually a variable, which is why we need to wrap it again. Run button. Viewer count is currently 50. There you go. So to sum it up, set local variable uses yellow box, and any yellow box inside SAMMI assumes that anything inside of it is either a variable name or a number. If we want to insert a string, we need to use single or double quotes such as this. Set string variable command is using a white box, which assumes anything inside of it is text. so we can just input the text directly without any quotes. For variables, if we want to use a variable inside a yellow box, we will just use the variable name, such as name. So name is SAMMI and name2 will be assigned to name, which is SAMMI. So both of these will have the same value. In the white box, we need to wrap name in /$ You can find more examples about how to combine variables and strings in yellow versus white boxes in our documentation. Another very useful thing are init variables, which you can edit by right-clicking on the button and going into init variables settings. You may ask, well, why do I need this? Well, before you press the button for the very first time, none of the variables are going to be initiated. And this could result in crashes if your button is expecting some variables to already exist inside of it. So let's show you on the example. Let's say we have set local variable count is 0. And each time we press this button, we want to add 1 to our count. Like this. The problem is, if we run the button now, you will notice count is 1. But if we run the button again, count is 1 again, because the button runs every command each time it's pressed. So count will be reset back to 0, and then we will add 1 to our count. So what we would do normally is that we would need to check if count already exists in our button. So if we will need to use if count is not defined, we will set it to 0. Otherwise, we will add 1. So if we run the button now, let's clear the variable, run the button. So right now count should be first, this command will execute, so it will be 0. The next time we run the button, count will be 1, because this time count is not undefined anymore, so it will jump to the else condition and adds 1 to our count. So right now count is 1. Next time we run the button, count is gonna be 2. And this is what we have init variables for, because we can avoid putting this if condition in altogether. So let's set the initial variable count should be 0. So this means that every time we reset SAMMI, the button's variable count will be set to 0. So when we run the button for the first time, count is not going to be undefined anymore. It will be 0. So let's try that. Let's delete all these commands. Delete all the variables. So now the button has no variables. We will reset SAMMI. Go back to our button. And as you can see, the count variable has been set to 0. So now all we need to do is set local variable count plus equals 1. So if we run the button now, count is going to be 1. If we run it again, it's going to be 2. If we run it again, it's going to be 3. So we don't have to worry about the initial value of the count, because that's handled by our init variables settings. The last thing that I would like to cover is the difference between persistent and non-persistent buttons. If you go to button settings, you will notice this option, local variable persist. What does that mean? Well, if you set the button to persistent, it means that all its variables will be accessible at all times and by other buttons, even if the button has finished. So let's create another button here. and grab the count variable. So let's name this button 1 and change the button ID to button 1, and this will be our button 2. And let's say we want to grab the variable count from button 1. So we will use the get button variable command. Button ID will be button 1. Get variable will be count, and save variable will be count local. So now if we check in our button 1, the current count variable is 2. So if we run this get button variable command, count local is also 2. So this button 2 can see button 1's local variables at all times. Now what happens if we set the button to non-persistent? You will notice that if we run the same command again in button 2, we will get a message that we are trying to get a variable from a button that is not persistent or does not exist. So it's telling us that either button 1 doesn't exist, which is not true because right here button ID button 1 exists, or is not persistent, which is true because we just unchecked this local variable persist option. So we cannot get any variables from other buttons if these buttons are not persistent. Inside our button 1, let's add an alert message. Current count is count. Now previously, every time we ran the button, 1 would be added to our count. So what happens if the button is not persistent? Run button. Current count is undefined 1. It means that it tried to add 1 to an undefined value. So as you can see, init variables don't work in non-persistent buttons. Each time we run the button, all the variables inside the button are reset. So this means that whatever variables we set in this button, for example, count is 1, name is SAMMI, and we run the button, the variables count and name will only exist while the button is running. When the button finishes, the variables are cleared, and next time we execute the button, SAMMI will not know that we originally set count to 0 and name to SAMMI in our previous button execution. So let me show you. Alert message. Count is count. And name is name. Run button. Count is 0 and name is SAMMI. That's fine. Let's delete these two variables and run the button. Count is undefined and name is undefined. As you can see, SAMMI doesn't remember that we already set count and name variables in our previous button execution. If you compare it to a persistent button, however, let's check persistent. And let's run the button. Count is 0 and name is SAMMI. So now the variables are set. And we can also see them in the variable window. If we delete these and run the button again, here we go. It remembers that we previously set the count and name variables. What happens if this button is set to overlappable? Overlappable buttons can be triggered every time, no matter if the button is running or not. So you can have, for example, 10 different instances of the button running at the same time. Now, if you check local variable persist, it means that all the instances of this button running at the same time will share its variables. If you uncheck it, it will create a new instance for each button execution with its own unique variables, and they will not interact with each other. The last thing I would like to talk about, since I've been using it throughout the whole video, is how to see variables inside SAMMI. And this is what our variable viewer is for. So you can either bring it up by pressing variable viewer button, or by pressing Ctrl Tab on your keyboard. If you bring it up in the SAMMI main menu or within a deck, you will see the global variable object that contains all the global variables and a list of all persistent buttons. And you can go inside each button to see its current local variables. If you bring up the variable viewer from your button, let's say button 1, and pressing Ctrl Tab, you will see the current button's local variables, which is count and name. That's pretty much all I wanted to cover today. If you have any questions regarding variables, you can navigate to sammi.solutions/docs, go to commands and variables. And here you have everything explained that I just mentioned in the video. Introduction, what are global, button, and local variables, the difference between persistent and non-persistent variables, what init variables do, variable types, and the most important, the difference between white and yellow boxes, with plenty of examples. So definitely check that out. And if you're still not sure about anything, you can always ask in our Discord server. Thanks.